encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network.
Welcome to the Holy Brief. On the Holy Brief podcast, we offer brief insights into big questions. This is season 2, episode 2 of the podcast. And I want to thank you for sticking with me and for tuning in to the podcast today. As always, if you have questions, feel free to send them in to me at thb@thelightnetwork.tv. Again, thb@thelightnetwork.tv. And we look forward to answering it on a later episode of the podcast. Today, we have another great question that's been sent in. Today's question is the Lord's Supper the most important thing we do when we worship God? We sometimes take the Lord's Supper to shut-ins, but what about the rest of the service? And also sometimes people take the Lord's Supper and then they leave because maybe they have something else to do. So this is a multifaceted question and it deserves to be answered in multiple layers. It's true that Christians are to worship God, and Jesus says we're to worship God in spirit and in truth, John 4:24. Worshiping God in truth means we worship God according to what he said, according to what he's revealed to us in Scripture. Worshiping God in spirit means that our spirits connect with God's spirits. As we connect with God through spiritual acts that he's prescribed for us to do, doing those things from the heart, we worship God in accordance with the Spirit. Worship must be both in spirit and in truth, with the right mindset, carrying out the right actions. Jesus told his disciples to remember him by taking communion or taking the Lord's Supper. Matthew 26 through 29, Jesus says, "This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And then he takes the cup and says, "This cup is my blood, which is shed for many for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in remembrance of me." And if you go all the way back to the first century in the book of Acts, Christians have been partaking of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week from the very inception of Christianity. The first day of the week is special and central in Christianity because Jesus was raised from the dead on the first day of the week. Mark 16, 1 and 2, Matthew 28 and verse 1. The church started on the first day of the week, Acts 2, 1 through 4. The day of Pentecost was always the first day of the week based on Leviticus 23, 15 through 21. And the church began on the first day of the week, and Christians assembled to partake of the Lord's Supper on that same day. Acts 2:42 says they devoted themselves or continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, the fellowship, the breaking of bread, and the prayers. Acts 20 and verse 7 says, on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread. So I would say about the Lord's Supper that it is a central act in worship, but not the most important. The most important would elevate it above the other acts of worship. Central just means that which everything else is centered around and the purpose for why we come. And Acts 20 and verse 7 makes this plain, that the Lord's Supper is central. It is important, but I wouldn't say it's valued or the most important above the others, but it is central. Acts 20 and verse 7 contains what's called in Greek an infinitive of purpose. When Luke writes on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, he's saying the purpose for Christians coming together on the first day of the week, among other things, was to break bread or remember Jesus in the Lord's Supper. And when you go to 1 Corinthians 11, Paul writes extensively about abuses of the Lord's Supper to the church at Corinth. And he repeatedly uses this phrase in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 17, and verse 18, and verse 20, and verse 33, and in verse 34, he uses this phrase, when you come together. And so as Christians came together, among other things, there would be the remembering Jesus' death, his burial, his resurrection, and his second coming through the Lord's Supper. And so one could argue, no supper, no service. What does this mean? It means the Lord's Supper is central, is valuable, it's important. That doesn't mean we need to make it an elaborate ceremonial thing. The New Testament knows no such thing, but neither does that mean we should sprint through it and rush through it as if it weren't important. We need to biblically strike a balance. As it relates to taking the Lord's Supper to shut-ins, I would say this is probably a practice that's well-intentioned, but unnecessary. The Lord's Supper is based on those passages in 1 Corinthians 11 that mention when you come together. 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 17, chapter 11, verse 18, and so on. And so if a person is physically unable to come to the assembly when we come together, whether they're sick, whether they're in prison like Paul was, or exiled like John the Apostle, then they're unable to assemble for the Lord's Supper and for the worship service of the saints. And we don't need to have some sort of make-up church service for them that turns the Lord's Supper into a sort of magical potion or ceremonial rite that a person has to partake of. And so I would simply say we don't need to take it to shut-ins. But If somebody argues, well, we want to do this, the Lord's Supper is central, but it's not singular. That would mean if a group of Christians decide to come together in a separate place apart from the normal gathered assembly and worship, then that's what needs to take place. Worship in its totality. There would need to be singing. There would need to be praying. There would need to be preaching. There would need to be the Lord's Supper. And then there would need to be financial contribution or giving where such was necessary or possible. And so we probably are better off just visiting those that are physically unable to attend and encouraging them to attend the worship services, and maybe just shut down the mobile church service because it was unknown in the first century. And the last part of this question about those that maybe take the Lord's Supper and then leave because they've got something else that they need to do. Maybe they feel like the most important box is checked. I would simply say, again, the Lord's Supper is central, but not singular. We must take the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week if we're going to follow in the pattern and the steps of first century Christians. But we must also sit under the preached word. Acts 2:42 says they continued in the apostles' doctrine or teaching or preaching of the word. In 1 Timothy 4:13 through 16, we need to sing and teach and admonish one another through singing. Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16. There need to be prayers offered up on our behalf and for the sick and for those that are in places of authority. 1 Timothy 2:1 through 8, Acts 2 and verse 42. Our financial contribution and our giving. 2 Corinthians 9:6 and 7 and 1 Corinthians 16:1 and 2. And in addition to those things, the partaking of the Lord's Supper. And so if somebody simply takes of the Lord's Supper and leaves, they haven't done all that Jesus wants them to do as far as worshiping and remembering him in the way that we do communally. And so to turn the Lord's Supper into a sort of drive-through Christian worship service where I can get my goods and go my way is something that Jesus never intended. As we think about this question, the answer to this question, the Lord's Supper, let's just remember that the Lord's Supper is central, it's important, but it's not singular, and it goes along with the other actions that we find laid out in the New Testament. Let's do what Jesus says and remember him in the way that he said he wants to be remembered. But let's also remember all that Jesus said and not pick our favorite part of that and then simply leave the rest or relegate the rest to being less important or not worthy of as much attention. Thanks for tuning in to the Holy Brief. I hope this answer has been helpful to you. Until next time, keep studying, keep searching, keep asking, but above all, keep believing.